God morgen og velkommen alle sammen til vår webinar God forskermorgen. Dette webinaret er organisert i samarbeid av Multiconsult og Hydrosen. Og en gang i måneden kommer en forsker fra Hydrosen og presenterer sin arbeid til oss i bransjen. Jeg skal fortsette på engelsk, fordi dette presentasjonen blir på engelsk. My name is Filip Atochka. I work in the hydropower section in Multiconsult, and I'm glad to present Linn Emilie Schaffer, who is going to talk about how to achieve cost-efficient and environmentally friendly hydropower operations. Please write your questions into the chat if you will have any, or raise your hand in the end, and we will take the questions after the presentation. Thank you very much, and you can continue, Linn.
Thank you, Philip. Good morning, everyone. So today it's my turn to present my research. So I'm a PhD student in Hydrosen in work package 3, and I work on modeling environmental constraints in medium-term hydropower scheduling models. So how to achieve cost-efficient and environmentally friendly hydropower operations? This is a quite large question, but my work looks into this from the perspective of the hydropower scheduling, how we plan operation of the hydropower plants. Okay. So this presentation, I will first give some contextual information. Why is this of current interest? I'll then talk a bit about modeling challenges of environmental constraints. Then I'll talk more about one particular type of constraint, a state-dependent discharge constraint. I will show you some results demonstrating the implications of this type of constraints from a hydropower producer's perspective. And then I will talk a bit about some research that I'm currently finalizing, which is more on the interplay between environmental constraints and reserve capacity requirements, before I finish off with some concluding remarks. So first, a bit of context. The transition to more sustainable power system is changing the conditions for hydropower. And on one side, we see changing market conditions. The decarbonization of the power system is changing the market structure. We're seeing a different price structure, and the value of flexibility is expected to increase. On the other side, or in addition to this, it's better to say, it's not only about decarbonizing power system. It's also, or it's a broader view than that, where we also have to mitigate negative impacts of power production in general. So we are seeing changing regulation that is driven by new or improved knowledge. There are a stronger political focus on a European level. And it's also driven by the market changes, because by seeing the market or the changes in market conditions are changing how we might operate the hydropower plants, and therefore also changing how operation must be regulated in order to mitigate potential negative impacts from these operational patterns. And then in Norway, we are seeing also this is also driven by good timing. We are in a period of time where we have revision of concessions. Many hydropower plants, or the concession of many hydropower plants, are being revised. And as a part of this, we might have new operational or new constraints on operation in order to limit ecological impacts, but also in order to facilitate other interests of use, such as recreational use of reservoirs. And so on one side, we see an increased value of having flexibility, but we also see new constraints, So environmental regulation, on operation, it transfers into a constraint on how you can operate your power plants, and that is potentially restricting your operational flexibility. So we consider these environmental constraints. They are very important, and the revision of concession is a very good opportunity to improve things that are not good enough today, being for ecological reasons or other interests. But at the same time, they might impose a cost. And this is from the perspective of the hydropower producer. This could be a cost of reduced energy production or reduced operational flexibility. So a reduced opportunity to produce when you want to produce. From the system perspective, it's also a cost because when we limit the operational flexibility, this might increase the cost of meeting demand and ensuring security of supply. So my work is concerned with the medium-term hydropower scheduling. So before I go on, I just want to remind you what that means, because I'm the type of modeling that I'm concerned with. The goal of this modeling is to find the optimal operation of the storage. How do we operate the reservoir in order to use the storage potential in the best way? So what we do in this type of modeling, or the main output that we get from this, is the water value. So this is the value of storing water. And what this is the opportunity cost of producing water. So instead of producing it, we could store it. So or the opportunity value, you could also say. And in a way, this can be used as or been seen as the marginal cost of power production from hydropower. So that you have this option to store is reflected as a marginal cost of producing, because when you produce, you do that instead of storing that water. And this problem is a problem that grows very quickly in size and can be quite difficult to solve. Just to clarify a bit, or to handle this type of problems, we rely on simplifications. They are necessary. And when you have, this is just a random example, but for example, if you have a cascade of hydropower plants, and in this case study, I wanted to look at the two upper reservoirs of this cascade. It turns out into something that looks like this in my world. So it's a representation of a reservoir, a hydropower plant, another reservoir, and a hydropower plant. And then you add details to this representation. So there are some capacity limitations on the reservoir, on the turbine. You describe the relation between water release and power output. There is some inflow modeling. You have uncertainty in different variables. For example, from the power producer perspective, you will have inflow and power prices and certain parameters. And then there might be other waterways like spillage, bypass, and you can add different type of constraints on how you want to operate this system. And then the underlying question in my PhD is with the increasing, or when we know that flexibility is becoming more important, it's also important, or we think that it's more important with accurate modeling of the things that limit this flexibility. And that is, for example, environmental constraints. So then the question becomes, is accurate modeling of environmental constraints important for this type of modeling? So do we need to include this type of constraints in medium-term scheduling? Should we prioritize that? Because simplifications are necessary, but we need to do qualified simplifications and prioritize what to include. And then it's not, in general, it's not so that all types of environmental constraints are difficult to include in medium and long-term hydropower scheduling. And in short-term modeling, you can include a lot more because you don't have the long time horizon and the same types of uncertainty that you have to consider. But in medium to long-term hydropower scheduling, it's particularly difficult to include a certain type of environmental constraints. And then we have this trade-off between accurate modeling, which gives you an improved solution, and solution speed, which makes it more practical to use this model. And complicating factors can be couplings in time of the constraint. It can be things that cause non-convex model formulations. It could be a more detailed representation of what happens when the water moves between different stations. But my focus lies within this non-convex model formulation, where you have different type of characteristics that could lead to this. It could be state dependent, and state dependent in this sense means that it depends on the current state of the system, which is, for example, the reservoir level. So I will come back to this later. It could be binary logic, and also other types of nonlinearities. And this has been a special interest of Norwegian partners because there is particularly one type of constraint that is imposed on several hydropower plants in Norway that has this state-dependent characteristic. And this is what is called, and this constraint has been a lot of the focus in my PhD. And it's known as a soft reservoir constraint, myk magasinrestriksjon. And what it is a state-dependent discharge constraint or a state-dependent discharge limit. And the purpose of this constraint is to ensure a high level of water in the reservoirs in the summer period. So, and this could be, or the main reason is to facilitate easy access to the water, and it could be for recreational interest. So this is a news article about this not being the case this year, that many boat owners have not been able to use their boat for recreational use because of low reservoir fillings. And it's also a scenic interest of this. But it could also just be for access, also for other use, also for animals. So just to go through a bit what this constraint is and why it's challenging. So if this is how the reservoir, the water filling in the reservoir develops through the year, and this marks the threshold that you want to reach. So it's quite high. You want the reservoir basically to be full in the summer period. This constraint is formulated in the way that before the constraint becomes active, there is no restriction on production. You can produce as normal and you can operate your reservoir as you want. When the constraint becomes active, and if your reservoir level is below the threshold, you're not allowed to release water from the reservoir. You have to stop production. Then, as inflow comes into the reservoir, the water level increases, and when you reach this threshold, you're allowed to produce again. But now you have to stay above this threshold until the end of the reservoir, the constraint period. And then after this, you're allowed to produce as normal again. And why is it formulated like this? Why is it not just a hard reservoir constraint that you say that you have to be above this threshold within a given date? Well, it's because there are big variations in yearly inflow in many places in Norway. So some years this will not be possible. Also, it might shift when the major inflow starts. So basically when the snow melting starts. So timing it could also be a bit challenging. So normally this constraint is activated around when the snow melting is expected to start, or it could also be activated by increasing inflows. And this constraint, it's state dependent. So you see that the constraint, it changes depending on the level of water in your reservoir. And this introduces non-convex characteristics in our problem, and it also introduces a binary logic in our problem. So that's why this constraint has been particularly challenging to model in medium-term hydropower scheduling, and therefore also difficult to plan for. At the same time as it's it's a constraint that that impacts the long-term operation or the seasonal operation of your reservoir. So you would expect it to be important to include in this type of scheduling. So I've looked at this type of constraint from first a hydropower producer perspective as a price taker in a competitive market, how we can include this type of constraint, and if there is an economic gain of including this in the water value calculation. So to do this, I've used a stochastic dynamic programming model, which makes it possible for me to include non-convex characteristics. And then I followed a very similar setup to what is used by the industry today, where we take in stochastic input data, a system description. We solve this stochastic model to find water values, which are then used in a simulation of the same system in order to see how does this strategy impact operation of the system. And you get some operational results out. So this is just a setup that allows me to, it's a simplification of how these water values are used in real world operations. So some results. So this is from a case study that I've done in part of my work. And for this case, we see that the purple lines here, it's the simulated reservoir filling when we don't include the environmental constraint. So, and then the green one is when we include the environmental constraint. So we see that there is a big change in how the reservoir is operated. And then this is simulated for many different scenarios, so many different inflow years. So that is what is giving the range of how you operate here by the shaded area. But basically, the constraint becomes active around here. And from that period in time, we see that the reservoir quickly fills up as a direct consequence of that you're not allowed to release water from the reservoir. However, we also see that we have a slightly different filling degree coming into the constraint. So if the constraint is activated around here, we see that there is also a change in the reservoir filling before this period. So this implies that there is a change in the water values. So the water values can be seen as a strategy for how you will operate your reservoir. And this change here is partly driven by the change in that strategy. Okay, so if we look a bit more at the water values, so these are water value curves for some particular weeks for the reservoir that is restricted by the constraint. And it gives the value for different levels of water in your reservoir. So this is the marginal value, and the black curves here are without the environmental constraint, and they have a very classic shape where you have a higher marginal value of having water when there is little water in your reservoir, and then as you fill up the reservoir, the marginal value increases. So it just means that the more water you have, the lower is the value of having one more unit extra of water. But when we add this state-dependent constraint, we see that the structure of this curve changes completely. So this is the green curve. And what this constraint does is that it gives you a higher value of having higher reservoir fillings. And that is because the model calculates in the consequence of when you have a low reservoir filling, you will not be allowed to produce within the specified period. But if you have a water level above this, you will be allowed to produce and therefore have a higher marginal value. So we see that this does impact the strategy for reservoir management. And then the next question becomes if this is important, if this matters. So then we did another case study for two different hydropower plants or systems where we calculated, or we calculated water values considering this constraint and not considering this constraint. And then we used them in a simulation with the constraint. And we did this for different expected power prices. So we simulate for a range of different scenarios, but these curves show the expected value of these curves. So we had what is perhaps a more traditional seasonal curve with lower prices in the summer. Then we also had the one with very high summer prices and one that was more flat, which is called the base here. And these are some reservoir curves from those results from some of the cases. So there were two different hydropower systems, and then here we see for two different of the price years or the price assumptions. And we see, so in this case also the constraint is, so here is the threshold that you want to reach. And for this particular case study, the threshold is like increasing, it's changing a bit for the different weeks. That's why it look a bit strange. But we do see a shift in the reservoir curve, and we see that it's a larger shift when you have a higher price expectation in the summer season, so within the constraint period. And did this give an economic improvement? It did for some of the cases that we ran. So in the most extreme case for the highest price, we saw an economic improvement of almost 2% for one of the systems. But we also see that this is the economic improvement that you can expect from including this in your medium-term scheduling. It depends on the hydropower cascade, the formulation of the regulation, how strict is the constraint formulated. And also it's very dependent on the price expectations. So if there is expectance of a higher summer price or quite even price throughout the year, or if there is higher price variation, so there will be a certain amount of high price periods within the summer season or the constraint period, then we see a higher impact of including this constraint. And this is illustrated very well by these two plots here on the side. So in the low price, so this is the production sorted by the power price. So in the low price case, we hardly see any change in how we produce. But in the high price case, we see that when we plan for this constraint in our strategy calculation, we are able to move production from periods with lower power price to periods with higher power price. And that is when we see this economic improvement here. Okay, so that was from the hydropower price taker perspective. The second part of my work has been focusing a bit more on the power system perspective or a cost minimizing perspective. And this is work that I'm currently finalizing, and I'm not going to say too much about it today. I just want to mention some very small things. But in this work, we're more focused on the capability to meet demand and reserve capacity requirements. So it's trying to look more on the capability of meeting the different flexibility needs that we see in the system. And this is also a very large topic, so my work only looks at a small part of it, but just to highlight the importance of this, this is a report from Statnett. And what we see is these are hydropower plants that have contributed or provided tertiary reserves. And we see that some hydropower plants are specifically important or deliver quite a lot of these type of reserves. Then the colors here indicate an ecological importance. So the orange columns are hydropower plants that has been marked to have a high or a potential for high ecological improvements. And then we see that there are many hydropower plants here that are important for or important suppliers of reserve capacity that also are very important, or where we also can have an improvement in the ecological status by imposing environmental constraints. So these power plants might have a new environmental constraint imposed. So in this work, I look at the small test scale power system with reservoir hydropower and limited transmission capacity out of this system. And then we impose environmental constraints and reserve capacity requirements and try to measure the flexibility impact. And since I'm still finalizing this work, I just want to show what type of results we can get from such a study and using medium-term modeling for this type of study. So for example, we can compare different products. So considering the demand and the need for upward spinning reserves, if we look at the dual value of the constraints, of these type of constraints, we get the marginal value or the marginal cost of meeting this type of service. So then we can see that the solid line here is without the constraint and the dashed line is with the constraint. And then we can see how this marginal cost changes. It indicates sort of the pressure on the system or how costly it would be for the system to deliver one more unit of each of these products. So for example, here we can see that it's a very similar structural change for demand and upward reserves, but a higher peak impact on the upward spinning reserve. And similarly, it can be used to compare the impact of different type of environmental constraints. So here I've also added, or there is a case run for a ramping constraint and a case run for a minimum discharge constraint. And for this particular case study, there was a reduced marginal cost of meeting demand when we added the ramping constraint, but we saw a quite large impact of the minimum discharge constraint. And it can also be used to compare cases without reserve capacity requirements, with reserve capacity requirements, or different levels of reserve capacity requirements. Okay, so that was just at the end. There was just a little bit on the work I've been working on most recently and finalizing now. And I think there is a lot of interesting things in this, which I also could have worked on for a longer time. But my PhD is getting close to the end, so I have to finish that. But to conclude, from my research, we do see that changing market conditions give higher importance of representing flexibility in decision support tools, and therefore also the type of constraints that limit this flexibility, such as environmental constraints. Some constraints are more challenging to model, such as state-dependent constraint. And for the state-dependent discharge constraint, we do find an economic value of including this in medium-term scheduling. However, we also see that it is very case-sensitive. And finally, we see that improved modeling of environmental constraints can be useful to investigate the interplay between different types of requirements that we have on the system. So, for example, comparing when you have environmental constraints and also reserve capacity requirements. How does this work together? And I think this is a very interesting topic, and it's very important in the situation we are right now, because we want to improve the ecological status of our power supply, but we also want to make sure that we maintain security of supply for the future system, considering the changes that the system is going through. So with that, thank you, and I hope there are some questions.
Thank you very much, Linn, for the super interesting presentation. And please write your questions into the chat or raise your hand. I can see there are 2 hands up. Let me see. Tim, you can talk now.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for a good presentation. Would be nice if you could also link to your research articles that you've published. I have a question about the economic improvement. So you, maybe I misunderstood you, but you were comparing the situations with and without constraints, right?
Yes. So first I have the first plot was with and without the constraint,
Yeah.
and then the economic improvement was not the economic improvement or the cost of the constraint itself. It is the improvement of just considering this constraint in your water value calculation. So the constraint is there. You have to handle it in your operation. You have to respect it in your operation. But what is the economic improvement or difference when you consider this constraint in your strategy for reservoir management?
Okay. And did you also were there any situations where the constraints were negative? Because that would probably be the most intuitive assumption.
Well, the constraints have a negative economic impact. All constraints that you add to your system will have either no impact at all or a negative impact, because you are when you have an optimization problem, the more constraints you add to it, the smaller the solution space. So these type of constraints, they come with a cost. But in this first part of the work, we were we were most interested in seeing how can we mitigate this cost by improving our modeling. So basically,
Okay.
you
Yeah.
have
Okay.
and in one of the cases, for example, if you turn it around, you could say that there is a cost of 2% of not modeling this well enough in your decision support tools.
Yeah.
Basically. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
No,
But in my first
I
article,
understand.
sorry, but in my first article, I think that there was also some cost figures of the constraint in general. So I can see, I think so. I can try and link to that article, but that will be very, very case sensitive. So
Yeah.
it's I think that's a challenge in this kind of modeling, is that when you get a final economic number, it's very case sensitive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think you clarified the question when I had about this comparison. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. The second one is Peter. Yes. You are on, Peter.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I actually have two questions. The first one is at the very beginning when you showed reservoir fillings to compare without and with constraints, they did not start from the same level. And I was wondering why, or at least it makes it difficult to compare, I think, just directly like that.
Yeah, it's because this is done for what is called a serial simulation. So you simulate many different weather years after each other. So the start filling is only the same in the first year that you simulate, and therefore, when the operation of this reservoir changes, it changes the average starting point. So it's correct that then the complete change here is not only because of the strategy; it's also partly because of how the constraint impacts the system here. But part of this change is due to the strategy. And in the second curves, in these curves, this is the change that you see only because of the strategy.
I see. The second question is more about the price model, because I'm not sure if I understood it completely. There is a just in the previous slide, I think that was also a good example when you had the different observed examples of high price and normal price or low price scenarios. But the chosen strategy is always depending on the forecasted price as well. So the choice of the strategy is not purely based on observation, but also expectations. And so when the expectations are correct, then of course your model will be performing more optimal. But when the expectations are wrong, then it will introduce disturbance to begin with. And so it's so that the differences may not necessarily come from your modeling constraints, but simply because there was a wrong price model to begin with.
Well, actually, in these, when we compare here, the assumptions in the simulations are exactly the same. So the only difference here is the strategy, and the strategy is calculated with the exact same assumptions except the environmental constraint. So I think for these results, it's very isolated that we only look at the change in the strategy due to the constraint. But I think you raise a very important point, because the result, or if you look at the economic improvement and the importance of including this type of constraint in medium-term scheduling, it is very dependent on your expected price within the constraint period. And the question then becomes how well you can forecast this early enough to actually plan for it well enough. But I think if you if we think about how the price structure is expected to change over time, looking a bit further ahead in time, it might indicate that this type of details in the modeling is more important, because with higher variability, there will also potentially be more hours with high power prices in the summer season, which easily said just increases the cost of not being able to produce within this period.
I see. Yeah.
And but
a little bit of a follow-up of this. Do you think that all the components of the price are considered here? Like all, of course, not everything, but like the main important things. And I'm thinking particularly about price of loss of water, because you can consider it like, okay, if we spill the reservoir, then we don't produce, and you have some kind of average price that is being lost. But it can also be looked at in a much more complex way when you put in like other environmental constraints or social values, etc., etc.
Yes. No. I don't think all the components of the power price is included in this study. It's there is uncertainty in the expected power price, and this is handled in a similar way as in the commercial models, but not as sophisticated. And then, of course, in real operations, the amount of time or resources that is put into forecasting the power price are at a completely different level than what I've done here. But it's a simplified structure, and I think maybe one of the main weaknesses here is the time resolution. So there is an uncertainty in the expected weekly development in the price, and then there is a price variation within the week, but it's a very simplified representation of the price variation within the week. So
funny that you say that this is a limitation. I thought it was an advantage because you filter out a lot of noise then.
Okay, well, maybe.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Was there one more thing? Maybe I forgot. Are you muted, Philip?
Yes, I was. Yeah, Bjarne had his hand up, but maybe he was wondering about the same things as Peter.
Oh, I can just add, because I forgot the spillage. There is no cost of spilling except that you lose water. Just so I mentioned that. Yeah. And Bjarne is typing, so.
Yeah, you can talk, Bjarne, if you want. You are muted right now.
Sorry, yeah. No, it was similar, so I withdraw my question, but thanks for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Do you have one more question, Tim, or is the hand up just from the previous one?
Oh, sorry, yeah, it's still up.
Yeah. I was wondering, you showed examples from 2 real power stations, which you then modeled with the restraint. Did you come back with feedback to them on what you found out, and did they change the way how they think about operating the schemes? Or was it was the constraint not real, and maybe it was just a hypothetical example?
No, in this case study, it's 2 real cases. So it's one BKK system. I guess it's Evy Ny now. Yeah. And one system from Trønder Energi, the Driva system. So it's Hamlagrøvann and Gjevillvannet, which we modeled here. There hasn't been like a direct feedback. I presented some of the results in the work package 3 for the members there. I think maybe for Trønder Energi, I also helped co-supervise a master student on the same topic, and she did an extended case study on that reservoir, and she presented her results for Trønder Energi at the end of her master thesis. So how they have taken those results and considerations, or if they've taken that into consideration, I don't know, but at least they are aware of the results, and hopefully it's have improved their knowledge about their system, and maybe it changes how they operate. I'm not sure.
Maybe so,
Yeah.
potential.
We'll see.
If you show that there is a potential to actually increase the money they make.
And I could also mention that in Hydrosan, in relation to this, it's also been other researchers working on similar topics, and so they're also worked on tighter formulations for linear representation of the same type of constraint. So that it means that in the commercial models that are used for this type of scheduling, there might be, or we're getting closer to actually being able to represent this type of constraint better in the commercial tools as well. So it is moving forward.
Perfect, thank you. Then if there is nobody else who wants to ask, it's 9 o'clock, so we are perfectly on time to finish. Thank you very much, Linn Emilie again, and good luck with the rest of your PhD.
Thank you.
Thank you.